Good evening, everyone. My name's Alistair Burt of the Conservative European Forum. It's a very great pleasure to see you all. And I'm here with Jeremy Lefroy, who I will introduce in a moment. A couple of housekeeping notices, if I may. As this is a Zoom meeting, I'd be grateful if you would mute your sound, which will help the bandwidth as we go through. That means when we get to questions, you'll be able to unmute yourselves and be able to speak and ask your questions as we go in. The meeting's been recorded and will be made available on the forum's website. For everyone who would like to ask a question, it would be good if you use the raised hand function. I suspect most of us are now very familiar with the process now. On your Zoom screen, you will find either under the More button or something similar, you will find an opportunity to raise your hand and use that opportunity. Navigate to the bottom options bar on your video screen and click Reactions. Underneath Reactions, there should be, if your screen doesn't go off, there should be a separate button that says raise your hand. Select this and a hand icon should appear in the upper left hand corner of your screen. To lower your hand, go back to Reactions and the bottom button will now say lower your hand. On mine, it's a bar at the top, it says More, and it gives you those same options, raise hand or lower hands. The chat facility is also open for anyone who type comments and ask questions. But I think as there's a decent number of us, I'm very keen to take questions orally from people who will have a chance to do so. It'd be easier for you if you use Speaker View for the meeting. To do this, click View in the top right-hand corner and select Speaker. I think that will be the way to do it. I've got Simon Saunders with me who will handle the tech stuff. That's very clear. In a moment, I'm going to introduce Jeremy Lefroy, but I'm very conscious that this is our first meeting since the death of His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh, and did not want the occasion to pass without a reference to that and a recognition, bearing in mind the outpouring that has been in the last few days of His Royal Highness's international standing and what he has been able to achieve and how well received he has been all over the world. I thought it might be appropriate to say a brief word. So let me read a very short appreciation, I hope on all our behalf. I was attending a reception in the Royal Gallery at the House of Lords, at which the Duke of Edinburgh was present. As he moved around from one group of MPs to another, he joined those with whom I was standing, and I introduced myself. He looked at me keenly. "Burt," he said, "Bedfordshire. I'm coming to your constituency, to Shuttleworth College." I was quite astonished. He was indeed coming, but it was about in a month's time. I rarely knew what I was up to the next day, let alone 4 weeks away. But here was this man well into his 80s with a grasp of his schedule, nothing short of admirable. Not for the first time, I appreciated how fortunate we all were to have such dedication from those who would be seeing our constituents. I make no claim to have known His Royal Highness well or have fulfilled numerous engagements with him. And to that extent, I'm not much different to every man, the hundreds of thousands, it may be millions of people up and down the country who, because of the length of his service, will have had a single moment with him, leaving a lasting memory. The stories emerging in the last few days paint almost a mosaic of the UK, as we hear those tales from those who met him in so many different places, a yacht club, in the forces, as a result of their efforts in the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme. The stories have a common theme. In a ministerial capacity, I was with him at an exhibition in London for one of his charities, following a few steps behind his party. The pattern was familiar. He would walk a few paces, stop, talk intensely with a small group, then there would be a burst of laughter all round, and he would move on. The privilege of joining him afterwards for that private chat and a cup of tea was matched by the need to have been completely on the top of the brief to answer his questions. He knew his stuff. His presence at an occasion was not for form's sake, and the popular caricature of royalty asking simple questions is far from the truth. On the occasions I was in his presence, He exhibited a real interest and awareness of the subject, from farming practices to foreign affairs to military and security matters. And his questioning was designed not to worry, but to give an opportunity to those he met to share a mutual passion or to deliver information which they felt was being absorbed for good purposes. This is a rare skill in chance encounters, and the ability to lighten the mood and introduce a laugh with a couple of words would usually seal a memory forever, I should imagine. My overwhelming impression is of a man who was always himself, who knew his reputation, but never played to it or became a caricature of himself. He gave the British people the courtesy not only of his duty, but of involvement with their lives in a likable manner, which they would never forget. How very, very fortunate we've all been. And with that, and I know the thoughts of many of us for such a great man, let me move on to the topic for this evening and introduce Jeremy Lefroy, who I suspect needs little introduction to most of us. Jeremy is the chair now of the Conservative European Forum Foreign Affairs Policy Group and contributed to the recent paper that was produced at the turn of the year. He was the Member of Parliament for Stafford and my colleague from 2010 to 2019. He's now a director of the East African equipment leasing group Equity for Africa, which he co-founded in 2003 to support SME finance and job creation. And he's also the vice chair of the board of the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. If there's anyone in the house who was immersed in Africa, and particularly East Africa, it was Jeremy, who understood it, spent time there, understood it from before he became a member of parliament and has returned to it afterwards. So who better than to talk about what's new in Africa and what's coming out of Africa in order to stimulate our conversation and questions after that. Jeremy, you're enormously welcome. It's great to see you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alistair, and it's just lovely to see you back after your little episode recently and looking as well as ever. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this, and thank you for your very moving tribute to His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh. If I may, I'll just say a couple of things myself in tribute to him. I've only met him twice. The last occasion was in 2017. It must have been one of his final public engagements, because he himself was patron of the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine for no fewer than 38 years. And he made the time to come and support an event that that was being hosted in London for the UK's work against malaria. And I just think that showed, at his age, 95 at the time, his commitment to the fight against malaria, which possibly had something to do with his having been in the Navy and travelled all over the world and seen the effect of malaria from his homeland, or the place of his birth, Greece. Malaria was not eradicated until the 1950s, after all. And by the way, the new the person who took over from him in 1991 was the Princess Royal, Princess Anne, and I had the honour of meeting her once, and her knowledge of malaria was extraordinary, and indeed all tropical diseases. So the royal family takes a great interest in this. And the second occasion was, like so many others, to receive my Gold Duke of Edinburgh's Award in 1976. And as a result of that, when I moved to Tanzania with Janet and the family in 1989, after a few years, we set up a scheme very much based on the Duke of Edinburgh's Award called Training for Life. Of course, the Duke of Edinburgh's Award is international, is operated in dozens of countries around the world, but this was a slightly longer scheme. But one of the main features of the scheme was that we like the expedition that you have in the Duke of Edinburgh's Award, we rounded off this 4-month training course for young people leaving school, teaching them life skills and so on, with an expedition, in this case up Mount Kilimanjaro. And that has continued. In fact, it continues to this day. It's in its 25th year at the moment. And hundreds of young people in Tanzania have done this. And it was just such a privilege for all of us, and particularly I think for the guides, to see Tanzanians being able to climb their own mountain, because most of the time Kilimanjaro is climbed by tourists. Very, very few Tanzanians ever get the chance to climb their own mountain. And here were young people from Tanzania doing that. We don't do Kilimanjaro at the moment because it is quite expensive, but instead we climb Mount Meru, which as many of you may know is quite close to Kilimanjaro and is still the same height as Matterhorn, 14,500 feet. It's still a great climb. In fact, it's probably even tougher than Kilimanjaro, not least because you have to have an armed guard because of the buffalo around. But anyway, that's just something practical that came out of His Royal Highness's work on Duke of Edinburgh's award that we were able to set up in Tanzania. So in my 15 minutes or so, I'm going to cover very, very little of what I would really like to say, you'll be glad to hear, but just give a few snapshots of areas, most of which were covered in our chapter in the report last November, which I think and we all think are important, and then hopefully open that up to questions from all of you, and we'll try and cover other areas as well. So I'm going to do this through in the context of some countries which I've been fortunate enough to visit. It's great to have John Corrie in the meeting, because I know John has far more knowledge and experience than I do, and I'm sure he will be able to correct me on lots of things, but it would be great to hear from him later on as well, given that he's still involved so much in South Sudan and that area. Just first of all, the context. As we know, Africa is the closest continent to much of Europe, and the population of 1.2 billion estimated at the moment is expected to reach at least 2.5 billion by 2060, which will be more than a quarter of the people on Earth. And Nigeria alone is expected potentially to have a bigger population than the EU by 2060. The continent has more than 25% of UN member states, 35% of Commonwealth members, and the African Continental Free Trade Area, which was established in 2019 and has come fully into effect this year, covers more than 1 billion people, more than twice the size of the EU single market. So what happens in Africa? And I'm talking today really about Africa in the Sahel and South, because Alistair has covered very well North Africa in his chapter in the pamphlet, and that's more his experience than mine. What happens in Africa is of immense importance to the world, and particularly to Europe. And I think we should also not forget how much Africa has been affected by being close to Europe: colonization, slavery, 2 world wars. Just to take one example, in World War I, it's estimated that well over 500,000 people died in Tanganyika as a direct or indirect result of fighting between Britain and its allies from British East Africa and South, and Germany from German East Africa. But so now and in the future, we need positive, productive, and respectful relationships. So the first country I'll touch on is Liberia, which I visited with the International Development Committee in 2014. Just one very interesting point about Liberia is the runway at Monrovia Airport is extremely long. And the reason it is long is it was one of the emergency landing grounds for the shuttle. So the shuttle, the American shuttle, space shuttle, needed landing grounds around the world that it could land on. And so the runways had to be long enough, and Monrovia Airport was one of them. Anyway, in 2014, when I was there with colleagues, the UK had recently opened an embassy. Very small staff, but it was absolutely vital because, as it happened, Ebola was just starting and became, as we all know, a terrible pandemic in that part of West Africa. But what that small office, which was basically an ambassador and an administrator, did was it gave us a strong presence on the ground, which is so key for developing relationships and solving problems. And one of the recommendations that we've made in our report for the CEF was that every single African state should have an embassy, an ambassador or a high commissioner. It doesn't need to be large. Liberia was a classic example of how you can have a presence without it being dozens of people, but it must be there. The head of state or government and senior ministers will meet an ambassador. They might not meet somebody of lower rank. It shows that you value the country and you value its people. We also, in our report, just while we're on this, recommended a separate ambassador for the African Union. We have one, a separate one for the European Union. We have 1 or 2 for the UN, but our ambassador, who's an excellent ambassador, formerly in South Sudan and in Jerusalem, is also the ambassador to the African Union. And I believe it's too big a job to be ambassador to Ethiopia and the African Union for one person. And again, it gives more gravitas to the position when it is a dedicated role. Finally, the final point I'd make on diplomacy here is visits by senior figures. I was astonished that when Prime Minister Theresa May visited Kenya in 2018, it was the first visit by a UK Prime Minister to one of our strongest allies, where we have a military base for 30 years. The previous British Prime Minister who'd visited Kenya was Margaret Thatcher. And indeed, if you compare the number of visits to the African continent that our senior members, whether in politics, to lesser extent in the royal family, make, compared with, say, President Macron, who in his time as president since 2017 has visited the African continent at least a dozen times, it shows, I think, a lack of attention paid by our government to our most important continental neighbour. I'll move on now to Nigeria. In 2016, our committee visited the country, and I stepped out of my hotel room one morning, made for the lift, and was blocked by several security guards. And I then saw the president of Turkey, who was trying to get into the same lift, and clearly they didn't want me in the lift with him. They booked pretty much the entire floor of the hotel except for my room. And what this shows is that Turkey is just one of many countries taking a much, much closer interest in Africa. You just have to look at the airline network of Turkish Airlines, which puts British Airlines to shame. China, Russia, and Simon, I'm going to ask you to show, actually, if you show the second slide, if you could, I'll come on to the first slide at the end if we have time, if that's possible. China, Russia, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Iran, and Japan are others. Here is just a summary slide of military bases across the Sahel and sub-Saharan Africa. And one point in particular you notice is Djibouti. Djibouti is home to several bases, including the United States and China and Japan and Saudi Arabia. Eritrea has an Israeli base. We, of course, the UK has a base in Nanyuki in Kenya, but you can see the wide variety of countries which have now military bases across Africa, which shows the importance they give both to influence, but also security. And one reason why it's so important, Djibouti is so important, is because Africa is vital for the world's maritime trade. We just saw a recent example with the ever-ready ship in the Suez Canal, an accident, but it wouldn't take much for somebody malicious to cause huge havoc to global trade in that region. And the only alternative is obviously around the Cape of Good Hope. And that takes 10 to 12 days longer, those of you who are in trade. So security is of huge concern. We know about the Horn of Africa and the problems really over decades since the 1990s, as well as parts of the Democratic Republic of Congo, a tragic conflict. People estimate that over 6 million people have died in the various wars there since the end of the 1990s. The Sahel, which we're hearing increasingly about, but there are new flashpoints, which many of you will be aware of, the Central African Republic and northern Mozambique in particular, where there's been some absolutely awful massacres recently by an offshoot of Al-Qaeda or ISIS, right down close to the southern border of Tanzania, so not far away indeed from East Africa. The African Union, which has been supported financially and in training by the UK, among others, has taken on major peacekeeping missions, and we should not forget that. In Somalia, for instance, where the Burundian army, the Ethiopian army, the Kenyan army, and the Ugandan army have all done some very, very heavy lifting. Just Burundi has lost well over 450 soldiers killed. That's more than the UK sadly lost in Afghanistan throughout that entire period in Afghanistan. So we can see that the African Union and its member states are taking on their shoulders the responsibilities of peacekeeping, but they need help and they need support. But there are also, unfortunately, non-state actors or proxies, such as the Russian Wagner group, who've been involved in northern Mozambique, although I think they've pulled out of there at the moment. So the UK has a major role. We're invited to offer training, peacekeeping in Sudan. As John will know, we had a battalion of peacekeepers there, the largest single peacekeeping deployment by the UK for many years until I think 2019, and support, as we're doing alongside French forces and other African forces, particularly the Chadians and the Malians in the Sahel. And I believe that's likely to grow, the call on our forces. But we also need, and I think we have a really important role here, to concentrate on peace building, both in training negotiators and peacemakers, and we stress in our report, particularly women, who so often seem to be absent from the negotiations, yet they are the people who are most likely to bring about peace. I'm a trustee of a charity that works in peace building in South Sudan, in CAR, and in Mauritania. It's a very small charity, but the work it does with local people working at grassroots in things as simple as, or not simple, but as basic as organizing markets, organizing safe routes for herders so that they don't come into conflict with pastoralists, is vital. And I think the UK has a major, if not unique, role that it can play in supporting this kind of work. Alongside, and I would always say this, our colleagues and friends in the European Union. I'll move on now to Ethiopia, where I was the Prime Minister's trade envoy for 2 years. And what the Ethiopian government ministers would say to me is we need to create 3 million jobs a year in Ethiopia, new jobs every year, because our population is 110 million and growing. We have all these young people who need to get very high numbers of graduates. There are nearly 40 universities in Ethiopia, yet we don't have the jobs for them. So one thing they've been doing, and could you put on the next slide, please, Simon, is building some massive industrial and agro-processing parks right across the country with very high quality infrastructure. This is one, it's actually an investment partially by a UK company, a clothing factory in Hawassa. And you can see this is a kind of factory which you would see a modern factory in say Bangladesh or Vietnam. These are coming to Ethiopia with all the infrastructure, with the water supply, the electricity supply, internet and everything else, and the roads and increasingly railways that are needed. So they've taken this very seriously. And they've had investors from China, from India, from the US, and indeed the UK, although perhaps we need to see more from the UK. The companies that I've seen there from the UK, Diageo, Unilever, Pittards, which is a family company based in Somerset that makes leather goods and employs up to 2,000 people in Ethiopia, and Hello Clothing, who you've just seen the factory of. But we need more of those. UK investors are generally welcomed, as the UK has a good reputation for training staff, training local staff, raising standards, not getting involved in corrupt practices, and taking a long-term view. But there are too few UK companies that are prepared to do that. But what's also recognised is that formal employment by relatively large international businesses is not going to meet this massive need of jobs for livelihoods for young people. We need to support local businesses, local SMEs. And I'll give an example from Uganda. I went to a Commonwealth youth conference in Uganda and met a young man called Ronald Katamba. He was an orphan. He'd worked to see himself through university, and he'd now set up an IT business in Kampala. He was writing software for smallholder farmers. One particularly good piece of software enabled farmers remotely to monitor the health of their cattle by taking their temperature and their heartbeat and sending that information to their mobile phone, so that they'd be able to see quite early on if the cow needed some kind of treatment, and they could get the vet in or treat it before it became expensive or the cow may have died. And indeed, the president of Uganda himself, who is a rather large cattle owner, he himself has used this. But this is a young man entirely self-made, who's extremely impressive. I met him last month in Nairobi because we are trying to help his business and support it through giving them some work. But what impressed me most of all was, yes, he was employing lots of others of his young people in Kampala, but he was also mentoring others. He's only 30, 32 himself, but he'd taken on the responsibility to mentor young people who might in the end become his competitors. They weren't working for him, but he saw that responsibility of giving back. I met another, not quite so young man, but called Knight Ganji from Zimbabwe, who'd gone to Botswana when he was just 18 or 19. And he'd taken the initiative. He decided he was going to get into marketing and public relations. And he went along to ShopRite, which is the large South African supermarket chain in Botswana, and said, I'd like to take over your account for you. And they said, okay, we'll give you a try. He just walked into the managing director's office. He did that. He then went to the local, he was only, I think, 18 or 19 at the time, went to the local radio station, persuaded them to give him some slots with payment in 2 or 3 months' time, and got the account. And he now has companies in 14 countries across Africa. And again, not only is he a very, very successful business person in his own right, he wants to put a lot back in for the young people of his own country. So he has bought up land to enable young people to learn how to farm with improved techniques and so on. So just 2 examples from Eastern and Southern Africa of people who are there, who are doing the work themselves. They're not waiting for anybody else to come along. But I think the UK has a great role to stand alongside them where they need help, access to finance and so on, to provide that, to enable them to provide that. Not just look to the large multinationals to come and solve the problems of unemployment. And another point that was made to me in Ethiopia and elsewhere, which I've seen myself, is that smallholder agriculture is going to remain a vital provider of livelihoods and employment for the foreseeable future. And not only that, for food security, for tens of millions. When I was again with the IDC in Goma, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, I met a friend and former colleague of mine whose UK founded business had revived cocoa growing among smallholder farmers in North Kivu. It had basically completely faded out. And now, after 15 years, this activity, which has received a little bit of support from the UK government through UK aid, but is very much a commercial concern, has grown from almost nothing to producing cocoa, which is valued at $100 million a year. Now, that is $100 million pretty much into the pockets of smallholder farmers, which they were not receiving before. And it's one of the many signs of how sub-Saharan Africa is gradually, over the years, and certainly in the 30 years since I first worked in Tanzania, becoming an important part of the global food security, especially as so much land elsewhere is either being degraded or lost to urbanization. Now, you may point out that cocoa is not a food crop. That's absolutely true. But what it does is it and coffee and many of the other crops that are exported, such as sesame, provide income, which is then used by all these farmers who are multi-crop farmers. They'll have many crops that they grow to improve the quality and productivity of their food crops, and so enhance food security for themselves while generating surpluses for elsewhere. I'll briefly touch on water, and then for this I'm turning to Kilimanjaro, again to Moshi, where I had the privilege of living for 11 years. And a few years ago, we visited a small holding on the mountain, which was formerly for maize. Now, maize, as agriculturalists will know, is not great for soil conservation, especially on the mountain, because it tends to result in soil being washed away. And from 1 acre of maize, you might get $200 or $300 profit a year. But this particular woman had purchased on lease a plastic greenhouse with drip irrigation, which cost about $10,000 in total, repayable over 3 or 4 years, but was earning her 20 or 30 times as much as the maize from growing capsicums, which she marketed in Dar es Salaam, Arusha, or elsewhere. And that's a classic example of where the water was available, but through drip irrigation, she was able to leverage the water supply enormously. And we're seeing that increasingly, not just with the biggest states, which have been concentrating on drip irrigation for some time, but also with smallholders as the cost comes down and the technology improves. And again, UK businesses and NGOs can work alongside farmer groupings and individual farmers to assist them with finance, expertise, and marketing. I'm on the board of Tradecraft, which is a fair trade organisation based in Gateshead, and they work, as do some other UK organisations, alongside such smallholder groupings and enable them to market their produce in the UK and elsewhere to the best of the best of their ability. And of course, much of this work as well contributes to the mitigation of climate change. I've just mentioned that if you change to grow certain crops, you can avoid things like soil erosion and runoff. But smallholder farmers are actually extremely good at planting trees. They, in my experience of working with them for 30, 35 years, tree planting is something they love, and you will find tree nurseries along the side of many roads, because they know that people will want to buy them, yes, to plant for fruit, so avocado trees, macadamia trees, coffee trees, cocoa trees, but also just for shade, and because they have a real love of trees and forestry. And at the same time, this kind of work will help with sustainable farming practices, such as zero-till agriculture. Finally, I've just got 3 quick ports of call, and they're all related to health. As Alistair mentioned, I have the privilege of being the vice chair of the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, the oldest tropical medicine school in the world, and one, as Alistair will know, one of the best kept secrets of the Northwest, which is doing a lot in Liverpool together with the University of Liverpool and the Royal Liverpool University Trust. And particularly in the pandemic, we've done a lot of, we've participated in many of the trials, helped to develop rapid diagnostic tests for coronavirus and so on. So these 3 places, one was Bagamoyo, the Kilimanjaro Institute, which I visited in, I think it was 2013, where we were looking into trials into a new malaria vaccine, which was developed by GSK and is now being rolled out. Now, one of the things about malaria vaccines is there's another one which has been developed by Oxford alongside the Ebola vaccine, and it's the same group that's developed the COVID vaccine. And what is quite clear is that the investment made by Alistair and people, because he was responsible for health in DFID at the time, in that kind of work, the development of those vaccines, has been enormously helpful in speeding up the development of the COVID-19 vaccine, particularly the AstraZeneca Oxford one. So here we see a complete relationship between the work that the UK has done in international development and tackling the importance of tackling the pandemic. The second place is KCMC in Moshi, Kilimanjaro Christian Medical Center, where my wife also worked, where work is being done in partnership with the Innovative Vector Control Consortium based in Liverpool, which I'm on the board of, on new types of treated bed nets to combat malaria. Again, work being done on a British-led but multinational group to better combat the threat of malaria, particularly which still kills well over 400,000 people a year, largely children and pregnant women. And then finally, just last October, when I was on a business visit, I went to Kisii in Kenya, where a new medical school has just been opened and is very keen to partner with a UK medical school or university so that we can have UK students going to Kenya and Kenyan students coming to the UK, and doing a lot more also by Zoom, which is a real innovation these days and will help, I believe, these kind of relationships. So research, development, the training of staff, these are all areas in which we can cooperate for mutual benefit. So I really just touched on the surface of a few areas where I think the UK in the future, together with partners and particularly from the European Union, can work together with our colleagues across the continent of Africa. But I just want to finally draw out what I think are the threads of this. Firstly, that these partnerships should be respectful partnerships. This is a time when we need to work together as colleagues. Again, that we should offer what is asked for. Too often I've seen cases, and I've probably been guilty of it myself, where we come and say, this is what you need and we're going to give it to you. Actually, that is not a respectful partnership. We need to work on what is required, and we need to learn ourselves as well. I've learned a lot from working with my African colleagues. We need to, and this applies to business or whatever area you're in, to be in it for the long term. Too often, and I sometimes say this to colleagues in the Foreign Office, that saying to somebody you can really only work here for 4 years and then you've got to move on if you want to be promoted, it's not the right approach. If somebody is good at their job, learns the language, gets stuck in a place, and they want to stay there and they're wanted there, let them stay for 8, 10, 12, 15 years. That's where the experience is built up. Moving somebody on just as they get to be good at a job seems to me rather counterproductive. I would also say we need to aim for the highest quality. Too often we perhaps say, oh, well, we can get away with this because it's not a, it's a developing country. Not at all. We have to show and work with our colleagues to show them the best and the best outputs. Working at ground level with small and medium enterprises, not just seeing multinationals or large companies as the only form of investment. I've seen some fantastic British family businesses who've worked for years and done extremely well and are very respected. Pitards, I mentioned in Ethiopia, being one of them. And above all, just to be there, to be present. That's what other countries are doing, and they are going to be there. We have to be there, and that's why we recommended that we must be at the highest level, an ambassador or high commissioner in every African state. Indeed, I'd say every state across the world, but we're concentrating on Africa here. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Alistair, and Liz and Simon.
Jeremy, thank you very much. I mean, you've kept everyone's attention quite rapt through what has been a masterclass in looking at some quite effective detail of Africa, as well as covering wide area of waterfront, and given very much the sense that here is somebody who knows something about it and cares even more. We have a series of questions already. If I could beg both questioners and Jeremy to be sparing in quantity in terms of response, that means we will get through more. And I'd like firstly to call Charles Tannock, and then after Charles, and after Charles has had the answer, Ivan Batucharov to be next. But Charles first.
Thank you, Alistair. Good evening, everybody. Jeremy, the European Union has lost a member state, Brexit, sadly, but the African Union goes from strength to strength. And I think it was 2 years ago, Morocco joined as the 54th state. And coincidentally, on the 1st of January this year, the African Union's free trade agreement came into force, the same day that we finally exited the European Union in all its trade arrangements. And of course, Liz Truss has announced that this country, United Kingdom, is going to join the CPTPP, the Pacific Trading Agreement, as a full member, although we're not a Pacific power. And I was talking to an African government official the other day, and they said that they have high hopes for the African Union free trade agreement, though, of course, like everything in Africa, it may take a little while and have a few teething problems. But the idea is eventually for the regional bodies like ECOWAS, like SADC and what have you, to all merge into this free trade area and become a sort of an enormous super customs union, which will become a major player economically on the global scene. And my question really is, I fully endorse your idea of having a dedicated ambassador to the African Union. And I visited it actually a few years ago when I did the report on the Horn of Africa. I went to Addis and I noticed a number of countries had separate ambassadors accredited, one to Ethiopia and the other to the African Union, including smaller countries like Portugal, for instance. But my question really is, should we be looking at the UK having some kind of free trade agreement with the African Union, particularly if and when it becomes a customs union, rather than trying to just develop our trading arrangements bilaterally with all the African Union member states. I know that multilateralism is not flavour of the month for this government, and they made it very clear that they don't quite like that kind of arrangement. But interestingly and paradoxically, as we wish to kind of go for the sovereignist bilateral approach, the African Union is trying very hard to emulate the EU model and have critical mass by putting things together at a supranational level. So what are your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Charles. Great.
Very much indeed. Yeah, I entirely agree. I think that we should engage as closely as possible with the African Union. I visited the African Union a couple of times when I was the trade envoy to Ethiopia, and it was made quite clear, that was after the referendums, it was made quite clear that they really wanted a close relationship with the UK. And I think we should do everything, if we believe in fair trade, and the government says it believes in free trade and fair trade, we should do everything possible to make that happen, because it's through trade, as I think most of us, if not all of us, would agree, that prosperity comes. So yes, let's do that, and let's not let obstacles get in the way. I don't know whether it would be possible for us to join in the same way as we're looking to join in the Pacific, but we should certainly have the closest possible relationship and endeavour to be very, very supportive. Thanks, Charles.
Thanks for a quick response, Jeremy. Ivan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Burt, and thank you very much, Mr. Lefroy, for the excellent presentation. It was fascinating to hear a number of developments and projects and important areas in Africa. And I'm particularly interested in the areas you mentioned around different powers, world powers trying to exert influence in Africa. It was interesting to see that France and Germany have quite a lot of, well, France quite a lot, and Germany as well, bases, so Western countries, but also other countries. You mentioned Turkey is portraying some influence, and then of course China, Russia, and so on. And at the same time, it seems that the USA is hinting that it will have less involvement to some extent in Africa than it has in the past. So in this context, what can the UK do? How do you see the UK's future involvement in Africa? And perhaps, are there ways we can cooperate with European partners, such as France and Germany, for example, in terms of developments and particular projects and initiatives in Africa? Thank you.
Thanks,
Ivan. After Jeremy's response, I'm going to call John Bois.
Thanks very much, Ivan, and may I thank you too, because Ivan contributed to our chapter on Sub-Saharan Africa in the report. I think my reflections are, clearly France has a very substantial presence because of its history, and it's after decolonization, France left a lot of under agreements with the newly independent countries, had a lot of bases, left a lot of troops permanently stationed in many of the West African countries in particular, and they've clearly taken alongside their colleagues in Mali and Chad and Niger, are taking a major role in combating the terrorism that's coming in the Sahel. So they are there. Germany, I think they are working alongside France and their African colleagues, as is the UK. Germany also has a base in Djibouti, and as does Italy, mainly because of the maritime interest there. United States, I would, if I was speaking to them, I would very much encourage them to stay fully engaged, because they are hugely important. And I think that whenever they have sort of pulled back from an area, I think they've regretted it, where they're a positive influence. And the United States has been, in many ways, a very positive influence. I mean, they have been, along with the UK, they've been by far the most important supporters of global health, and particularly on tropical diseases and malaria. So I very much hope that they don't pull back on that. But as you rightly point out, there are many other countries with very different interests, although on maritime, I think everybody has interest to combat piracy, but very different interests that are getting involved, some around business, some very much around extraction of minerals. And let's not forget that Africa has huge resources of some of the most sought after minerals, and they need to be the ones who benefit from this, not those extracting. Now, we as Britons are not in a great position to say that given our history, but nevertheless, we want to see that those people who with bases in and across Africa, A, that obviously they have to be invited by the host country, but B, they are there for the benefit of security and the protection against the kind of terrorist threat that we sadly are increasingly seeing.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. I'm going to call John Bowis, and after John and your reply, Jeremy, a couple of questions from the chat box from Nicholas and Andrea. But John Bowis first.
Thanks, Alistair. Thank you, Jeremy, for all the points you've been making. And I particularly liked your one on tree aid. I think trees are crucial in developing in Africa. And I remember in Chad, in the villages where they measured their personal wealth by the number of mango trees they had and so forth. But I want to follow your point on about respect. And certainly very often in many countries in Africa, when I've been there, I've had two messages. One is, why do you only talk about the crisis in Africa and never about the achievements of Africa? And I wonder if perhaps we could look at ways of developing some sort of African trade fair in the north to highlight what they are achieving. And many of those items you've already mentioned. And the second is that they very often say, particularly in the health field, do you realize the damage you're doing, your aid programs are doing, to our ability to recruit people for our health services? And when I say, yes, I understand we shouldn't be taking your doctors and nurses and bringing them into Europe, they say, no, that's not the point. The point is that the NGOs, the international NGOs, go into these countries and they recruit people to work for them while they're there, and they pay them the international sort of rates that they would expect to pay. And when they move on, it's unsustainable. And so the country can't afford to keep those people who've actually been well trained. And I just wonder if you could have your thoughts on both those issues as to how we could move forward in a supportive and respectful way.
Yes, on the second point, John, absolutely right. I remember in 1994, after the Rwandan genocide, we were living in northern Tanzania at the time, and there were well over 1 million refugees who came over into the Kagera region of Tanzania and over the border into Congo and Goma. And in Tanzania, obviously the agencies went and set up there, and they simply drained the local hospitals of all the medical staff. And that was a real problem. So the refugees got much better medical care than the local Tanzanians in that area. And that breeds resentment. And as you say, it brings unsustainability. Now, sorry, the first question, I should have written it down, was on...
The first question was on showcasing.
Oh, showcasing, yeah, absolutely. I'm a great believer in that. I mean, if you take, if I go back to Tanzania, and I won't apologize for that because I love the country, it's my second home. When we first went in 1989, there were 80,000 tourists a year. Now there's well over 1 million a year. When we first went, it had been a difficult time. The 80s were a very difficult time in Tanzania with the so-called, basically, if you were in business, you were an enemy of the state almost for some of the time. And that changed under the President Mwinyi, and from 1985 onwards. And so, but it was a difficult time, and many Tanzanians would say so. But now, if you go, Tanzania last year moved to being a middle-income country, lower middle-income country, ahead of schedule. And although sadly the president has passed away recently, they have an excellent new president in place now, and we wish her all the best for the future. But Tanzania has, and by its own efforts largely, by its own efforts, the efforts of its people has moved up into being a lower middle-income country. Kenya too, and you could say the same about lots of other countries, and I don't want to pick one or two out. I just saying those two because they're the ones I know best, but I've seen huge advances, and that's at the same time as population growth has been quite substantial. and yet they've still managed to do that. So, and a slide I forgot to show at the end was a slide of some health research being done in Quilombeiro, in the Ifakara Health Institute in Bagamoyo, and this one was in Korogwe on the way to Tanga. I mean, there's some very, very fine researchers working in collaboration with UK scientists and scientists across the world. And my view is I would entirely agree with you, there's much to be celebrated, and we should do much more celebrating of that.
Thanks, Jeremy, very much. I've got two related questions now to take together from the chat box, Nicholas McLean and Andrea Knowles. So if you give them both together, and then Jeremy can answer after Andrea's question. They're similar.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, for a fascinating insight. Where are you most concerned about the impact of the proposed aid budget cuts, and what can be done to try and get the government to think again?
And Andrea, similar point?
Hi, my point's similar. I'm interested in what you think the impacts of the aid cuts will be on the reputation of the UK across African countries. Is there much concern, or do some countries just believe that the likes of China will fill the void being left by the UK? Thank you.
Thanks both very much. Jeremy.
Yes, so Nicholas, yeah, great question. I mean, I suppose the two areas where there are many areas, but the two I would point out are medical research and health, because there's an awful lot of work that goes on in cooperation across the UK, whether in Scottish, English, Welsh or Northern Irish universities, the schools of tropical medicine, and centres of excellence across Africa. And I'm really concerned about that. It's often not that expensive, but the money that comes from the UK is often the money that makes the difference, that allows those institutions to develop and to exchange expertise. So that's one area. Another area, and I declare an interest because I was one of the people involved in getting it going, is the Small Charities Challenge Fund. It's only maximum £50,000, but as I saw from organisations in my constituency, it makes a huge difference. It means it's usually local volunteers running charities within international dimension that are doing great work on the ground. And at the moment that it hasn't been scrapped, but it's been suspended. But I very much hope the FCDO reinvigorates it and actually puts more money into it, because it wasn't a big budget line at all, but it made a real difference in communicating to people in the UK, taxpayers in the UK, that local people in their own area were working voluntarily on schemes in partnership with charities in the developing world, and this was having a great impact. So those are two areas. There are many others, but and on the question of the perception, I don't think China will necessarily fill the gap because they tend to be more focused on infrastructure. We haven't done so much on infrastructure. They may do, others may try and fill the gap, but I think everybody is under strain at the moment. I think there is still, we mustn't forget that there still will be a lot that is being done. The UK's commitments to multilateral organisations such as the WHO, such as the World Bank, and the UN will still be there because we make those commitments. It's to some extent the programmes that the UK runs and that are badged as UK aid that will be hit, and that's where I am concerned. I would, if I were the FCDO, I would try to keep as many of the programs going as possible, even with reduced budgets, to keep the coverage, because the expertise that you gain is so important, and it would be very interesting to see what happens. I mean, 0.5% is still a considerable amount of money. Obviously, it's a lot less than 0.7%, but it's still a considerable amount of money, even at a time when our GDP has gone down. And I think there are ways of using that wisely.
I think someone's clock was a little bit early. It's not quite 7 o'clock yet. If people are content to go a couple of minutes over 7 o'clock, then we should fit in the 3 questioners that we have left. If I could take Gary Ogavani first, and then Robert Morland.
Good evening, everybody, and Jeremy, thank you very much for a fascinating insight, and what a vast amount of experience you obviously have. My question was simply put one in terms of fair trade. I was interested to hear you mention that, and has it reached its full potential? A slightly loaded question, perhaps, because it probably hasn't. So I just wondered what your thoughts were around that, in particular with UK working with those African countries in the future in the positive ways we've been discussing, perhaps.
And Robert, I don't know your question, but if you'd like to give your question now, then Jeremy can answer both together, and that will leave us with the last question after that. You're muted, Robert.
Oh,
there you go.
Thank you very much. My question could be summed up in 2 words, which is South Africa. Do you regard it as a rather separate situation from the rest of Africa? And do you think there is a clearer need for more help to be given to South Africa to get its act in order, particularly over such things as corruption? So actually it in itself can give a lot of leadership and help in the rest of Africa.
Thanks very much, Gary and Robert, for those great questions. On fair trade, obviously I declare an interest, and I'm a trustee of Tradecraft, but yeah, one thing we should, and we don't celebrate enough in the UK, is the UK is the world's biggest fair trade market. At least when I last looked, it was well over 2 billion a year. And although the UK was late to the party with fair trade, Germany was well ahead. Because the UK adopted a very pragmatic approach to fair trade rather than a political approach, it was embraced by, if you like, both the left and the right of the political spectrum. I remember Caroline Spellman, our former esteemed colleague, and Alistair himself, who were very, very supportive of fair trade at a time when in Germany, for instance, it was seen that it was very much a sort of centre-left thing. So the UK has a great story to tell about fair trade. It has got its challenges because it's been so successful. Lots of other organisations have tried to emulate it or take on board some of the characteristics, whether it's Rainforest Alliance, whether it's Max Havelaar, whether it's, and they all have different aspects to them. But I personally think there's an awful lot more that can be done. I actually have just taken over, I've become part-time role as executive director of an organisation called Cafe Africa. And one of the things we do is we work with the Global Coffee Platform to try and bring some baseline standards for growing coffee, which everybody will adopt. They're not fair trade standards, but they underpin what the coffee world, both the roasters, the retailers and the growers are doing. And to be honest, without the fair trade movement, I'm not sure these things would ever have come about. So fair trade has an enormous impact way beyond even the quite high levels of sales. But yes, there is a lot more that can be done. I remember I was involved with it quite early stages when it was very much a sort of niche product. And it was when the supermarkets began to realise that actually British consumers wanted to know where their produce came from and wanted to know that it didn't involve slave labour and that fair prices had been paid, that they took this on. On the question of South Africa, very good point, Robert, and I think South Africa it already plays a massive role in regionally and indeed continent-wise. Clearly, it would like to, and it could do more. And clearly, as with many countries, and that's not just in Africa, it's across the world, corruption is an issue. And I know that there are many people in South Africa at the highest level who really concerned about this. It has an extremely active civil society. It's got a press that will take people to task. All those things are vital, as we know in our country. I mean, we're not free of corruption in this country. And what one needs is a civil society and a free press, and people who are prepared to stand up and be counted on that. So I'm a great fan of South Africa as a country, and and the people and what they're doing. But it's got a lot of challenges, and the challenge that I've referred to earlier on a number of occasions is unemployment. It's a challenge which applies right across the globe, but a country like South Africa needs to create perhaps not quite the same number of jobs as Ethiopia does for its young people, but it certainly needs to create a lot of those. And there are people there who are trying to do that and who've got the bit between their teeth, and there are perhaps others who haven't.
And following on from that, our last question now, it puts a slightly different an onus on the corruption question, and Tom Simpson's got this just to have our last question. I think it's sufficiently different to elicit a particular another answer from Jeremy. Tom, if you'd like to ask your question.
Yeah, hi there. So firstly, thank you both to Jeremy and Alistair for talking through it and hosting. I was basically wondering, once British companies are established in country, what can the UK government do, really, if anything, to protect them from corruption once they're already there? Because obviously corruption is a huge killer of FDI. Business leaders in Britain don't want to deal with corruption in those kind of countries, and it ends up in unfair competition if there's kind of accusations of cronyism and whatnot. So I'm just wondering, from a kind of external perspective, what can the UK government, in your experience, do?
Yes, what more can we do there as opposed to those states themselves?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think there are a number of things that can be done. The first is, I'm a great believer in trade associations. So in Kenya, there's quite a strong group of associations, Britain-Kenya, Chamber of Commerce, there's the Eastern Africa Association, of which I'm a trustee. And I think trade associations work well. I chaired the Tanzania Coffee Association in the 1990s. And if you work together as companies, whether it doesn't have to be British-owned companies in a particular area, then you know that you're less likely to get picked off one by one if there is somebody who wants to do that. It may well not be the case. So I strongly recommend any British investor very early signing up to a trade association and getting involved, trying to maybe get elected to a position. We set up a company in Kenya last year, and we immediately joined the Eastern Africa Association, the British Kenya Chamber of Commerce, and we will continue to work with those organisations and engage with the government and raise issues. So that's what I would do, number one. Number two is, I believe we need a greater Department of International Trade presence on the ground. So it is better than it was, but we are still, you go to some countries and you still find that a country like Sweden has more trade diplomats in their embassy than we do. And Sweden is a sixth the size of our population. We need to be much more serious about that. And that means having good people and we do have good people, we just don't have enough of them, in the embassies and high commissions who are there, who are ready to if they see, obviously if a British company is behaving badly, then we would hope that they would point that out, and they certainly wouldn't back them. But that is definitely the exception rather than the rule. If they see a British company being victimized or running into trouble unnecessarily, that they're prepared to back them and fight their corner for them. And I have to say that on the occasions when I've seen that happen, our diplomats are usually very good, but there just aren't enough of them, and there aren't enough of them with the right expertise at the moment. But I think that will change. At least I hope it has to change.
Jeremy, thank you very much. I think everyone will agree. We've had a really super hour from someone who knows and understands Africa, being able to answer all the questions with a hint of that knowledge and hinterland that's behind it. Jeremy, that's been really great, and you've covered so many different areas. I'm sure we're all absolutely indebted. So in whatever way we all can on screen, we can express our appreciation. So that's been really terrific. Thank you very much. Best wishes to you when you go back to East Africa and all the work that you're doing. But your knowledge and appreciation is obviously very deep. And in your new role as chairing the Foreign Affairs group of the forum, you'll obviously bring that depth and that extent of wisdom into what you're doing sort of on a broader basis with colleagues who are working on international affairs. So that's really, really great. So thank you very much for that. Simon has put up a little note about the next opportunity we have for the forum, an upcoming event, a webinar with BIM Afalami on the challenges and opportunities facing the city, jointly with Conservatives in the city. That's at 6 o'clock, 1800 hours on April the 21st. And Simon has put the Zoom registration link in the chat for you to follow. To everyone who has been, anyone who's been on board who isn't a member, please visit the website and all that. And Andrea, yeah, I'm fine, thanks very much. Keep very well. And again, everlasting thanks to Papworth Hospital and the NHS for their repair work. But to everyone, thank you very much for coming along. It's been a really good session, a lot of knowledge, and thank you enormously to Jeremy for speaking to us and being the fount of such knowledge. Thanks very much. Unless there's anything else, I think that closes it for the evening. Go off and patronise some various pubs nearby in order to keep the lockdown at bay and to get back on to where we want to be. All the best to everyone. Look forward to seeing you next time.